so much for having me. Thank you, Katie. Thanks for the kind words. Really, is such nice words. So what I want to do first is a tradition that used to be more of a tradition in classical music about 200 years ago or so, which is improvisation. In those days, it was maybe more, in a sense, like jazz. Classical players, Chopin, Beethoven, Mozart, they all improvised all the time. And then we stopped nowadays, and I think it's too bad. And so I'll improvise something with your help, if you don't mind. If you could give me a few random notes, and individual notes. And not to worry, if you don't read music, don't worry, because A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that's it. You can sharp them, you can flat them, you can say A flat, D sharp, whatever. Those work, but that's pretty much it. So I need a few.
C flat.
C flat, which is good. It's a B, but it's the same thing. Although in a violin, it's not the same thing. Yeah.
D minor.
D minor. Well, let's just do D, just individual notes. Is that okay? Yeah. D. Okay. Anybody else?
F sharp.
Okay, that's a nice statement. Maybe one or two more.
B flat.
Okay, maybe that's like a little wild card you gave me. I like that. I could do something with it. Okay, well, let's see what happens. Thank you. You gave me the notes, so you did that. So now I'm going to play some more real music. Well, not that that's not real. I'm sorry to insult your theme. I didn't mean it. It's a nice theme, but pieces that I prepared. I'm going to do two different Ave Marias arranged for piano. First of all, I love playing arrangements, and I think almost everything tonight is some sort of an arrangement. With an arrangement, it's almost like a selfish thing. I can pretend to be something that I'm not. So in this case, I can pretend to be a singer, and I'm absolutely not a singer. I've tried and failed miserably. I have a friend that's a singer. I tell this story often, but it's a little bit sad. So I have this singer friend who would say to me, you know, anybody can sing, everybody can sing. You have to breathe, you have to trust yourself, and all that sort of hippie stuff like that. And I said, okay, let me try that. And I tried the breathing, and I tried the being true to myself, and I sang a few notes, and my friend said, on second thought, maybe not anybody can sing. Don't do it. But so, the first piece, this first one is Ave Maria by Schubert, arranged by Liszt for piano solo, because I'm not singing it. And Schubert, interestingly enough, the text for this is not the Latin Hail Mary prayer. That's what usually people sing it with today. If you hear anyone from Pavarotti to Perry Como, they sing it in Latin. But Schubert wrote it with a German text, a German language translation of part of Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. It's a King Arthur legend. It is also a prayer to Mary, but it's a different text. It's German, it's different. So Schubert died at 31 years old in 1828. He was very ill in his last few years and knew that time was limited. I read he would fall asleep usually on his friends' couches. Sometimes he was homeless. He would fall asleep wearing his glasses and wake up with his glasses still on, just for the simple reason that he would write music literally until the moment he fell asleep and then from the moment he woke up. And he was extremely prolific, especially with Lieder, this Lieder, vocal, songs for voice and piano, of which Ave Maria is one. And so when he died, he was pretty much unknown in Vienna, except for some friends, very devoted friends, who would do these evenings with his music, Schubertiad evenings, you may have heard of those. But other than that group of friends, he was unknown, he was penniless. He would play piano in bars just for a few scraps of food to eat in those last years when he was so ill. And it's quite tragic, he was just not known. But after his death, people started to discover his genius, really, and his sincerity. Like his music, Schubert's the kind of composer who music just poured out of him. Like Mozart was like that. Beethoven was not like that. Beethoven had to chisel away at every note and struggle, and then the results are glorious, right? But with Schubert, it's just, these melodies just came out of it like nothing. And Liszt came across his music at some point in the 1830s, 1840s, and this was when Liszt was starting to really perform a lot and kind of like invented the piano recital. You may have heard of Listomania. Liszt was like a rock star at that time. He modeled himself after the violinist Paganini, who many people thought was possessed. Actually, more on Paganini later, but that was the time. And one of the things Liszt did in those early concerts, he improvised, by the way, but he featured his own arrangements of Schubert. And in a way, those were like the soul of those concerts, because the Schubert Lieder, they not only are just so beautiful, but they captivated the spirit of early 19th century romanticism that was just in the air at that time. And so you've heard this before, you've heard Ave Maria for sure, but maybe not Liszt's version. What Liszt does, because Liszt, he's a brilliant, not only composer, but brilliant arranger. And a good arranger is like a good translator in literary works. A good translator doesn't do Google Translate word for word for word. No, they reinvent the piece, the literature, the poem or whatever, in the new language. And so Liszt, likewise, reinvents the piece for the piano. The first time through, he gives us the Ave Maria melody pretty straightforward. He doesn't change a whole lot, just like you've heard it sung. But then, the second time it comes around, the melody, Liszt adds a lot of curls and twirls and things. Or even, now that ain't Schubert, all those extra notes. That's Liszt added in. And there's some debate about this. Some people will claim that, Liszt was a show-off, he was a showman. He could be that, but he was so much more than that. And he understood that without those additions to the music, it could be dull to just replicate what Schubert wrote without the voice and without the words. So that's what's going on there. That's, as an arranger, he adds those things to enhance it as a solo piano work. So here is Schubert Liszt. So it's really Liszt's rendition of Schubert, Ave Maria. wife's also a pianist, and recently she was asked to play for a wedding. And one of the requests was Ave Maria. And so my wife asked them, which one? And they said, don't get smart with us, young lady. There's only one Ave Maria. And she said, well, there's a few of them. And she ended up playing the Schubert, and that's what they wanted. But there's several others. I heard a beautiful one recently by Max Reger. But here's another, somewhat, maybe not quite as famous, but another famous Ave Maria arrangement, of course. This is the Bach-Gounod Ave Maria. In the 1850s, Charles Gounod was hanging out with his father-in-law, and they were looking at Bach's Prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier, which goes like this. And speaking of improvisation, Gounod improvised this melody on top of it while his father-in-law was playing the music. You know, he just came up with this melody on top. Etc. And that became the piece. Gounod later, the father-in-law jotted it down, and Gounod sort of edited it and published it as a violin piece first. Then he added words. He added the Latin Hail Mary prayer, not another German text like Schubert did. And then he published it as a vocal piece. And so there are wonderful recordings of this, like for example, I'm obsessed with the violin. That's another thing I try to be that I'm not a violinist. And Jascha Heifetz, who's one of them, one of the gods of music. He recorded this, and the first time through, you hear him playing the melody on the violin. Then you hear a choir sing the music. So it's sort of a violin / vocal work. Yeah. So this is funny because what I'm going to play for you is sort of a 4-person composition. It gets confusing, okay? So it's got Bach in it because of the Prelude in C major. So there's Bach. It's Gounod because Gounod came up with the melody. It's the father-in-law because he helped sort of write it. And then this is a piano arrangement by Georges Bizet. So 4 people. Bizet, by the way, is the guy who wrote Carmen. So he made this solo piano arrangement. And by the way, I was telling you about improvisation used to be more popular in the 19th century. Same with the art of arrangement. Bizet, for example, Liszt did so many arrangements. Bizet wrote published this whole set of pieces called L'Art du Chant, the art of singing on the piano. So he would take vocal music, transfer it to the piano. I love this stuff. I maybe could go back to the 19th century if they had air conditioning, but no thank you, but there's some things I'm a little bit obsessed with. So anyway, this is the Bach-Gounod Ave Maria. It's another Ave Maria, but it's also Ave Maria. So. you. Now I'm going to do another Liszt arrangement. This is of Robert Schumann, Widmung, which means dedication. It's a famous piece. And Widmung is also a song, it's a vocal piece. It's the first of a set of songs of a song cycle called Myrten or Myrtles. The text of this is by Friedrich Ruckert. My German is just trying to use my throat to say it, right? But when I was traveling recently, I went to Austria and Germany, and people said to me, your pronunciation is perfect, but everything else is completely wrong. So that was a nice compliment. So this is a piece, Schumann wrote this as a wedding present for his wife, for his fiancée, Clara. And getting to the point that they could be married was not an easy, path. Here's the story of it. So first of all, Robert Schumann, unlike Mendelssohn and Mozart, he was not a child prodigy. He started out, he wanted to be a lawyer, so he went to Heidelberg, University of Heidelberg, flunked out. So that didn't work. Then he wanted to be a virtuoso pianist. He was born at the same time, 1810, Liszt was born 1811, Chopin 1810. They were all born around the same time. And this was the era of something changing with the pianos, the technology. You see this piano inside, you see this metal, this is a cast iron frame. And it allows for these big orchestral sounds to be done on the piano. I mean, basically, with a cast iron frame supporting the strings, they won't snap if I do this. But the Viennese pianos, the older from the 18th century, they would just break. You maybe heard stories of Beethoven pounding away, playing his music, and just strings would snap. It wasn't completely his fault. It was sort of the fault of the technology. Didn't have this cast iron frame. My point is that because of the cast iron frame, you had legions of virtuoso pianists. Liszt was part of this trend. There were others that maybe we don't remember so much today, like Alfred Dreischock, for example. One Paris newspaper said that he played so loudly that if the wind was right, you could hear him in Vienna from Paris. But Schumann wanted to jump on this trend, and so he started practicing like crazy. In his 20s, he got a teacher named Friedrich Wieck, and then he damaged his hands. They don't know exactly why. Maybe the possibility is that he had gotten a contraption meant to strengthen the pinky finger, some sort of wooden mechanical device. And that's not a good idea. He actually damaged the muscles in his hands. Also, Schumann had bipolar disorder. Maybe that's the central thing really in his life. Because in those days, they didn't really know what that was. They didn't have treatments for it. They didn't get it. I mean, not that we know what it is completely now, but we have more therapeutic approaches to it, I guess, than back then. And Schumann suffered a great deal from this, and definitely you could say felt the highs and the lows of life, just very much so. Now, his piano teacher, Friedrich Wieck, did not like him very much. He didn't like the fact that Schumann had sort of not kept playing. He damaged his hands. He viewed Schumann as a bohemian type, maybe like a beatnik or something. They didn't have beatniks back then, but and the problem is that Friedrich Wieck's, the piano teacher's daughter, was Clara Wieck, and they fell in love, Robert and Clara. And the father, the piano teacher, forbade the marriage. So for several years, they couldn't get married. And then they finally did. And by the way, they became a great musical power couple, Robert and Clara Schumann. They're both great musicians. And this piece is a testament to his, to his love for her. I think this is one of the greatest love songs ever written. You could put it up there with Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Yesterday. Really, it is. And because it depicts the feeling of being in love. Schumann's music, by the way, is never too stable. Once I was playing some Schumann piece, I don't remember which one. Let's take this one and pretend that it's the one. I was playing for my teacher, and I played it, I wasn't thinking, and I was being sort of an airhead. I played it like, it's nice, but I feel like you just woke up, you're wearing a bathrobe, you're sitting having a nice cup of coffee, reading the newspaper. That's not Schumann. Schumann's music is always on fire with something. And Schumann, another comparison I've heard people say, look at Van Gogh's paintings, the starry night, the sky, how it swirls. Schumann's music swirls. By the way, they both suffered from mental illness, right? So the piano concerto of Schumann sounds to me like that painting. And the same with the Widmung. The accompaniment is like waves in the ocean. It doesn't sit still. It's turbulent and unstable. And I was saying that this, I think it depicts the feeling of being in love. When you're in love, you don't feel ordinary. You might have an elevated heart rate. You might have butterflies in your stomach. And it sounds like that. This whole piece sounds like that. It's this exhilarating thing. And I guess you could say on the manic side, because Schumann, remember, he had bipolar disorder. So this, for Schumann and for music in general, this is just one of the most exhilarating pieces ever, I think. And it's so Schumann's arrangement here. Funny story about Schumann, Liszt's arrangement, excuse me. Franz Liszt and the Schumanns. Liszt and Robert Schumann got along somewhat okay, but Clara Schumann and Liszt did not get along. Clara sort of hated Liszt. She thought he was a vulgar show-off. And so then when Liszt wrote some of his most show-off pieces, the Paganini Etudes, guess who he dedicated them to? Clara Schumann. You know, people had a sense of humor back then, too. So they were not statues, the composers. They were human, and they played pranks on each other, and they had, you know, all sorts of, you know, flaws and genius and everything. So here is Widmung by Robert Schumann, arranged by Liszt for piano. Thank you. So, let's see, what should I do next? Looking at the time. You know, I like to play this piece. I'm thinking sometimes I mix and match at the last minute. I'm going to play you this piece by Liszt himself. This is the Consolation number 3, also in D flat, just like that. No, that was in A flat. What am I talking about? So, so this piece, Liszt wrote it in 1849, right after the death of Chopin. They were friends. Well, let's put it this way. Liszt considered Chopin to be his friend. Chopin did not consider Liszt to be his friend. As much as I love Chopin, go read his letters sometime, and oh boy, he could be an acerbic person. And more than that, he could be quite nasty and anti-Semitic too, actually. I was very upset to find out reading his letters. But Chopin really looked down at Liszt. He thought Liszt was a sort of a crass showman. See, a lot of people have had this view of Liszt, and I don't think it's true at all. I think Liszt, here's about Liszt. On the one hand, yes, he was like this rock star-like. He was apparently a very good person. He was very extroverted. He was very giving and kind. Maybe some people thought that was something wrong with him, that he was so nice. I don't know, but sometimes that happens. I've noticed. But here's this thing about Liszt and about what a paradox he was. That Liszt was deeply religious as a Catholic, in addition to living the lifestyle of wine, women, and song, and that's not an exaggeration at all. That's understated. But he, at many points in his life, wanted to become a priest. And there's a story that in the end of his life, you might see photographs of the older Liszt wearing a priest's collar. There were photographs at that time, the 1870s and 80s. So he would live in the Vatican, take minor orders. And one day he decided, okay, I'm going to get ordained. I want to be a priest. So he went to the Sistine Chapel. And unfortunately, there was a piano there. Well, he sat down and started improvising. Half of the nuns fainted. And the bishop came out, tapped him on the shoulder, and said, listen, buddy, you better get out of here. This is not going to work. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't deeply spiritual. He had this great inclination as a religious person. And I think this piece is more in that vein, because this is as introverted a piece for Liszt as you can imagine for such an extrovert, for such a showy person. And even in tribute to Chopin, it sounds like Chopin in the beginning. If I told you this was Chopin, you would believe me, I think. It really sounds like Chopin. And there's also this, there's this feeling of maybe weariness in it. And I think that, he didn't live under a rock. 1849, what happened in 1848, if you think back to European history? That was a year of violent revolutions. Many people died. And Liszt must have been affected by it. You could feel the sadness of that disillusionment, because one historian I read said, if you want to know what 1848 was like in Europe, learn about 1968 in this country. Similar. So that's the time. This is like 1969, when this piece was written, 1849. So here is the Liszt Consolation number 3. Consolation, consolation, it means like to console. And it's based on a poem by Lamartine, a popular French poet at that time. And still is. So now I'm going to play part of a larger piece, not the whole thing. Have you heard about Buc-ee's in Mebane, how they're building? I live in Mebane. Well, this is sort of like Buc-ee's because it's not, this is my own arrangement and it's taking a long time, like Buc-ee's. So when I'm finished, maybe it'll be around the time Buc-ee's is finished, I don't know. So this is Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a Theme by Paganini. And it's for piano and orchestra, and I'm sorry I can't fit an orchestra here. The other option would be to carry around a boombox with a recording of the orchestra part, but that seems a little, what if they go too fast or too slow, you know? So I'm trying to make my own solo piano arrangement. I'm beginning to regret it, but it's too late to stop, so let's see what happens. Rachmaninoff, his life is really, I look at his life as being divided in roughly two parts. In one way, half of his life almost was in the 19th century, and then roughly the second half was in the 20th century. And his music reflects that. 19th century romantic Russian music, and then something 20th century. Although the Stravinskys and Schoenbergs did not consider him very 20th century, it doesn't matter. He still lived in the 20th century, and his music is 20th century. And then also half of his life was in Russia. And then in 1917, when the revolution happened, he and his family, they got out, settled eventually in the US. So half of his life in Russia, half in the West. So that's what it was. And actually when he left Russia, he couldn't write music for like 15 years. He was in another period of depression. He suffered from depression at various points in his life. And one of those periods was in the 1920s. He was performing a lot and revising pieces, but his creative juices dried up. But then in the 30s, it came back. but his style changed so much that some people think, I was talking to some people who say, I don't like his late music. They said, it's not the same Rachmaninoff. That's right, it's not the same. But how could he be the same after everything he'd gone through and then how much the world had changed and was changing? So if you've heard, the second concerto, that's young Rachmaninoff, younger, under the influence of his mentor Tchaikovsky. Or the third concerto. Rachmaninoff's melodies, especially in those days, would just go on and on forever, like an endless Russian meadow. That's what it is. Here's another, the B minor prelude of Rachmaninoff from Russia that he wrote. It's almost like you're flying over the Russian tundra in Siberia. But then he came to America and he heard jazz. He didn't want to, but some friends dragged him to. He said, I don't listen to popular music, And boy, was he shocked when he heard Art Tatum play. He whispered to that same friend, if he ever plays classical music, we're all in trouble. My Russian accent's not bad because my mother's Russian. And so half of me is Russian. I'll tell you more about that later, it's interesting. But yeah, so here's the beginning of the Paganini Rhapsody. After hearing those early Rachmaninoff earlier pieces, this is 1935. That's what happens when you put a 19th century man in Midtown Manhattan in the 1930s. That's what you get. And that's what it is. So in his later years, his style became a little sharper, a little more sarcastic maybe. It's 20th century, that's what it is. And influenced by America. You're still gonna hear Russian bells. He was obsessed with the sound of Russian church bells. He was a devout Russian Orthodox Christian. Although they did excommunicate him because he married his cousin, but I don't think he paid attention. That's bells for you. And then there was this, you're also going to hear Paganini, because this piece is roughly based on that. You hear that in the beginning and then you really don't hear it. Because this is not an arrangement of Paganini, it's a rhapsody or like a fantasy-like piece based on that theme. So Paganini from the early 19th century. And Paganini, I think I mentioned, people thought he was possessed by the devil. So just like Robert Johnson, the blues musician in the US. So same story, it's this recycled myth. Now, so you're gonna hear that, you're gonna hear bells, and then another ingredient in the late Rachmaninoff stew is, or maybe we should say borscht, right? My mother is, I told you she's Russian, and she called me last week, and my parents live 30 minutes from me. And my mother says, Robert, you have to come, I make borscht. I said, Mom, it's North Carolina, it's 98 degrees and 98% humidity, I'm not gonna eat borscht. That's the power of Russian nostalgia for you, okay? So here's the melody that's you're gonna hear also. Have you heard this before? This is the Dies Irae chant from the Middle Ages, the Day of Wrath. And that is a menacing theme. I think he was obsessed with it in his later years because maybe he was thinking about mortality. Maybe he was also, this is my belief, he was sensing what was happening. World War II was about to start. And he just felt something ominous. It's a very ominous theme. Have you ever seen The Shining by Stanley Kubrick? You know when they're driving up the mountain to that creepy hotel and you can see that snarl and Jack Nicholson's face, I don't know, but that's the music that's playing in the background. It's very, very creepy. So here is Variations 1 until I really ought to stop of this work in progress. It's my arrangement of Rachmaninoff Paganini.
Rhapsody on a Fever Tiger.
sorry to leave you hanging. That's about 1/3 of it. There's more. So, but it's like the Buc-ee's thing. It's just not ready yet. So eventually, I need a little. Sometimes this kind of music is like your cardio too. So. So I'm going to conclude with a couple short things, a couple more short classical pieces, and maybe a gospel at the end. So here's why I play gospel. I know people think that's really odd, and it is. So I told you my mother's an immigrant from Russia. My dad's an immigrant also from Southern Virginia. And he raised me on gospel all the time. My mom was raising me on classical music. So it's a sort of an odd mix of things. So anyway, a little more Russian music. This is very appropriate for the season now. Flight of the Bumblebee by Rimsky-Korsakov. And I'm going to do 2 arrangements. The first is by Rachmaninoff's arrangement. So this is from an opera called The Tale of the Tsar Sultan from 1900, when he wrote it. And in the beginning of Act 2, there's this prince who turns into a bumblebee so he can fly into the royal palace and see the Tsar, who happens to be his dad. It's a Russian fairy tale, and they're all very weird. So, what Rachmaninoff does in this arrangement is he doesn't change it a whole lot from the original. He's pretty close to what Rimsky-Korsakov wrote. The next one is not close to what Rimsky-Korsakov wrote. You might start itching, because it really sounds like some obnoxious guys flying around in space, That's the point. It's such pictorial music. It just makes you feel the sensation of a bumblebee flying around. So here is Rimsky-Korsakov, Rachmaninoff arrangement of Flight of the Bumblebee. Well, I'm going to play you a different version of Flight of the Bumblebee. Have you ever heard 2 people tell the same story? One person keeps to the facts and the other person doesn't? Like they embellish. My dad, being very Southern, that's what he embellishes. Every time he tells a story, a few years go by, he tells it's even more embellished. Well, that's this version. This is György Cifra's version of Flight of the Bumblebee. And Cifra, spelled Cziffra, was a Hungarian gypsy pianist, and he was one of the greatest ever. Should be appreciated more. In the early 1950s, he tried to escape the regime because it was occupied by the Soviets. And he got caught and was sentenced to a Soviet prison camp to hard labor for several years. And this damaged the muscles and ligaments in his arms. I don't know how it affected his piano playing. I never could hear it. It's impossible because he played like, I don't know, he's on another planet, this guy. And you could see in videos though, he would wear these thick leather bracelets to support the ligaments in his arm, but it didn't stand in the way. When he finally got out, he got to Paris, that's where he lived the rest of his life, and he played jazz piano in bars for a while, and then he got discovered and he was greatest pianist. You know Vladimir Horowitz, right? He's one of the greatest pianists also. And I think it was he who said, he's one of my favorites. I think he said secretly, I want to be Chifra. You know, that's because everybody wants to be Chifra. I tried to want to be Chifra listening to his recording of his arrangement of this. No way. Can't do it. But let me explain what he does here with Flight of the Bumblebee. It's going to be very different. This is not Flight of the Bumblebee. It sounds like the swarms of hornets and yellow jackets. The whole thing is like that. This is one of the most insane pieces I've ever played. So good luck to you, and good luck to me. So it's getting late. I'm going to close, as promised, with an old-timey, very old-timey gospel song. Because this is also the music I grew up on. By the way, I grew up in New Jersey, too. This is odd. Nothing wrong with that, right? But you know, when I go back there, I start talking like this. Hey, how you doing? So it's yeah. So here is in a New Jersey style on the Jericho Road. I'm just kidding, not New Jersey style. This is a beautiful old-timey gospel. This is one of those gospel songs that they don't have them in the hymnals anymore, and they don't really sing this much in any churches. Maybe somewhere out in the deep country, I don't know, but this is pretty country. Great evening. Thanks for coming. Just grab this real quick.
Thank you for coming.